Grief is a strange and silent conversation. It's a one-sided dialogue with a memory, a constant replaying of last words, of shared laughter, of moments you didn't know were final. You're left with a void, an ache for just one more conversation, one more chance to hear their voice. You tell yourself it's impossible. You accept the silence because you have to. But what if the silence breaks? What if, from the static abyss between our world and whatever comes next, the impossible happens? What if they call back? This isn't a story about the comforting idea of a message from the great beyond. This is a story about a connection that should have been severed, a line that should have remained dead. It started with a phone call, a familiar number on my screen that made my heart stop. A number that belonged to my grandmother, who had been buried for 6 months. I answered the call. That was my first mistake. What followed was a descent into a nightmare that proved to me that some doors are closed for a reason, and that sometimes the voice of a loved one can be the most terrifying sound in the world. My grandmother was the cornerstone of my life. Her house was my second home, a place of warmth, stories, and the scent of old books and spices. After she passed away, the task of clearing out that house fell to me. It was a heartbreaking process, each object a landmine of memories. I had been at it for a week, surrounded by boxes and the dust of a life well lived. It was a Tuesday night late. The house was quiet, the kind of deep, hollow quiet that only an old, empty house can have. I was sitting on the floor of her study, sorting through old photographs, when my phone, lying on the dusty carpet beside me, began to vibrate. I glanced at the screen. My blood ran cold. The caller ID was simple, Grandma. It was impossible. Her phone had been disconnected 5 months ago. I had done it myself. My first thought was that it was a technical glitch, a recycled number, a cruel coincidence. My thumb hovered over the red decline button. My rational mind screamed at me to reject it, to dismiss it as a painful anomaly. But a deeper, more desperate part of me, the part that still ached with grief, needed to know. My hand trembled as I swiped to answer. I put the phone to my ear, my breath caught in my throat. At first, there was nothing but static, a sound like a distant, rushing ocean. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The static crackled, and then a voice came through. It was faint, distorted, and sounded like it was being spoken from the bottom of a well, but it was unmistakably her. It was my grandmother's voice. "Alex." The voice rasped, stretched, and warped by the static. "Alex, my darling, can you hear me?" Tears streamed down my face. I couldn't speak. It was her. "Grandma." I finally choked out. "Hal, no time." The voice crackled, growing more urgent. The static intensified, sounding like breaking glass. "They don't know I'm speaking. You have to listen. It's not safe there, darling. He's in the walls." "Who, Grandma? What are you talking about?" I was sobbing now, a mix of joy and absolute terror swirling in my chest. "The house, it remembers him," she whispered, her voice fading. "He's in the walls. Don't let him out. Don't open the cellar. Whatever you do, don't open." The voice was abruptly cut off, replaced by a deafening shriek of static that made me throw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. The line was dead. I sat there, shaking, in the silent, dusty room for what felt like an hour. I finally crawled over to my phone. I checked the call log. There it was. One incoming call, from Grandma, lasting exactly 47 seconds. I tried calling the number back. A sterile, automated voice answered immediately. "The number you have dialed is not in service. Please check the number and try again." Sleep was impossible that night. Her words echoed in my mind. "He's in the walls. Don't open the cellar." It had to be a dream, a grief-induced hallucination. But the call log was still there on my phone, a digital ghost mocking my attempts at rationalization. The next day, I tried to continue my work, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. The comforting silence was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old house settling, sounded menacing. I found myself staring at the walls, tracing the patterns in the old wallpaper, imagining something moving just beneath the surface. Her warning about the cellar was what truly unnerved me. It was a small, stone-walled room at the back of the house, accessed by a heavy, oak door that was always kept locked. My grandmother had used it for storing preserves and old furniture. As kids, we were never allowed down there. She'd always said it was damp and full of spiders. Now, that simple rule felt like a dire, long-standing precaution. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen when I heard it for the first time. A faint scratching sound. I froze, listening intently. It was coming from the wall that connected the kitchen to the cellar. Scratch. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It sounded like fingernails dragging slowly across old wood from the inside. My heart hammered against my ribs. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the wall. He's in the walls. The voice from the phone echoed in my head. I fled the kitchen, locking myself in the living room, telling myself it was a mouse, a rat, anything but what my grandmother had warned me about. But the sound, I knew, was too loud, too methodical for a rodent. The phenomena escalated. I started hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, that seemed to emanate from the electrical sockets. The lights in the house would flicker and dim, especially when I walked near the cellar wall. One evening, I was walking down the main hallway when every single framed photograph hanging on the wall, pictures of my family, of my grandmother, of me, crashed to the floor at the exact same moment, the sound like a gunshot in the silent house. I was living in a state of perpetual fear, my grief replaced by a raw, gnawing terror. The call had not been a comfort, it had been a curse. It had opened my ears and eyes to something that had been lurking in the house all along, something my grandmother had apparently spent her life trying to keep contained. I had to know who he was. The scratching was getting louder, more insistent. The whispers were becoming clearer, sometimes sounding like they were calling my name in a mocking, stretched-out imitation of my grandmother's voice. I turned the house upside down, not for packing, but for answers. I searched through my grandmother's study, through her diaries, her letters, her old documents. I found a locked wooden box in the back of her wardrobe. After forcing the rusty lock, I found it filled with yellowed newspaper clippings and a single, faded photograph. The photograph was from the 1930s. It showed a stern-looking man with cold, dark eyes, standing in front of the house. On the back, in her familiar handwriting, was a name, Silas. The newspaper clippings told his story. Silas was a reclusive and cruel man who had built the house and lived in it decades before my grandparents bought it. He was a man steeped in local legends of dark practices and strange rituals. The articles detailed his sudden, mysterious disappearance. He simply vanished one day, leaving behind a house filled with strange symbols painted on the walls and a cellar that had been sealed from the inside. One article quoted a neighbor who claimed to have heard hammering and screaming coming from the house for days before Silas disappeared. The final clipping was the most chilling. It was from a few years after Silas vanished. A family had bought the house, but they fled after only a few weeks, reporting to the police that they could hear a man's voice whispering and scratching from within the walls of the cellar. They claimed he was trying to trick them into letting him out. My grandmother had known. She had lived in this house for 50 years, coexisting with this thing. She had kept the cellar locked, not because of spiders, but because of Silas. The call wasn't just a warning. It was a desperate attempt to pass on the duty of being his warden. That night, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I sat in the living room, the box of clippings on my lap, my mind reeling. The phone rang again. I looked at the screen. Grandma. With a trembling hand, I answered. The static was thicker this time, angrier. Alex. The voice crackled. He knows you know. He's angry. He's changing his voice now. Don't listen to him. Don't believe him. As she spoke, another sound started to bleed through the static. A low, guttural chuckle. The voice of my grandmother grew fainter, more desperate. Don't let him. He's pushing me out. And then, the voice changed. The static cleared for a moment, and a new voice spoke, clear and smooth and dripping with malevolence. It was a man's voice. She was so strong. It said, a cruel amusement in its tone. kept me quiet for so long. But death weakens the connection. And grief opens doors. Thank you for answering, Alex. All I needed was for someone on this side to pick up the phone. It wasn't my grandmother. It had never been my grandmother. It was Silas. He had been using her memory, her voice, as a lure. The warnings were a trick, a double bluff designed to make me focus on the cellar, to make me acknowledge his presence, to feed him with my fear. What do you want? I screamed into the phone. The voice chuckled again. The cellar door is so very old, Alex. Its hinges are so very weak. But a living hand can turn the key. Open the door, Alex. Your grandma is waiting for you. She wants to thank you. A loud, violent bang echoed through the house. It came from the cellar door. Then another. Bang. And another. The heavy oak door was shuddering in its frame, as if being hit by a battering ram from the inside. I dropped the phone and ran. I fled the house, leaving everything behind. The boxes, the memories, the voice on the phone. I didn't stop running until the streetlights of the town felt like a safe harbor. I never went back to the house. I left it all for the bank to reclaim. I told my family the grief was too much for me to handle. How could I tell them the truth? How could I explain that my beloved grandmother's voice had been hijacked by a century-old evil to trick me into unleashing it? I still have the phone. I don't know why I keep it. Maybe as a reminder. Maybe out of some foolish, lingering hope. Sometimes, late at night, it still rings. The caller ID always reads the same. Grandma. I never answer. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and my guard is down, I can hear a faint ringing from somewhere else in my apartment. A phantom sound. And I realize, with a fresh wave of terror, that he doesn't need me to pick up anymore. He knows I'm listening. And he's just waiting for me to get lonely enough, sad enough, to want to hear her voice one last time. Be careful what you wish for. In the silence of grief, not every voice that calls back is one you should answer.